the people in this room, like all of us who are in politics. And they tried to keep him out. He was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really launched the...
Welcome, everybody. Very haphazardly thrown together stream. They are close to voting on Trump impeachment. They voted to call witnesses earlier and then didn't call any witnesses. We'll talk about that. The vote is upcoming. It's all happening very, very quickly, so I'm glad you're with me here.
Of black civil rights protesters, college students, I think in North Carolina, AT&T, and he saw a picture of them on the cover of the New York Times, and they were sitting in at a lunch counter, and he looked at the picture and he said, they looked the way that I felt. They looked the way that I felt, and he said he had to go down south to Mississippi, and they launched the voting rights movement. That's where the phrase "one person, one vote" comes from. It was not invented by the Supreme Court. They would go door to door to try to register people to vote. But anyway, Julian Bond was part of that movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, nonviolence. It was the end and it was the means, nonviolence. And he ran for the state legislature in Georgia. A path other civil rights.
Yeah, I mean, just for kicks, you know, people are asking how many Republicans do I think will vote to convict. I'm going to say 4. I mean, I really don't know. I have no idea. But expecting a vote relatively soon.
And so they said, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is taking a position against the Vietnam War. You're a member of SNCC. We're not going to admit you because you took a position against the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said you cannot prevent someone from swearing an oath to become a member of a legislative body because of a position that they took or a group they were part of took before they got sworn in. That's the exact opposite of Donald Trump. He got elected to office. He swore an oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He served as president for 4 years, right up until the end, when he wanted to exercise his rights under the imaginary January exception, and he incited a violent mob and insurrection to come up here, and we all know what happened. He is being impeached and convicted for violating his oath of office that he took. He's not being prevented from taking his oath in the first place. The First Amendment's on our side. He tried to overturn the will of the people, the voice of the people. He lost that election by more than 7 million votes. Some people don't want to admit it. Counsel for the president could not bring themselves to admit that the election's over.
If you're just joining us, we are in closing arguments, closing statements in the second Donald Trump impeachment trial. Trump, the only president to be impeached twice. Trump, yes, a lot of other firsts, but the one that's relevant today, Trump, the only president to be impeached twice, and we are standing by for a vote expected very, very soon. We saw a 55-45 vote earlier to call witnesses, and then no witnesses were called. And there's a lot of different explanations as to why. House Impeachment Manager Jamie Raskin speaking now. I see a lot of messages coming in, and we're going to have plenty of time to go over everything. Chakaseki saying, David, I was surprised Vanderveen didn't go with the famous Philadelphia hoagie defense argument. Yeah, I was actually thinking they would bring up Bruce Castor to debate the merits of what is a sandwich, but...
Thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. President.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President, the Senate is now ready to vote on the article of impeachment.
Here we go.
And after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
Wow. This is it. This is it.
The clerk will read the article of impeachment.
Patrick Leahy removing his mask for an historic moment. An historic. Yeah, a lot of people, Denver McCarthy wanted to hear Bruce Castor's thoughts on pizza. There's just so much Bruce Castor could talk to us about, and it's really a missed opportunity, I would say. Thanks, Anchovy, for the Twitch sub. Appreciate it. We will see a full reading of the impeachment article and then a vote, roll call vote. 100 senators, presumably all 100 will vote.
Article 1, incitement of an insurrection.
Senate will be in order.
The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Further, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits any person who has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding any office under the United States. In his conduct while President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath, faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States in that, on January 6, 2021, pursuant to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate met at the United States Capitol for a joint session of Congress to count the votes of the Electoral College. In the months preceding the joint session, President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud and should not be accepted by the American people or certified by state or federal officials.
She really should say
Shortly
fraud.
before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. There he reiterated false claims that we won this election and we won it by a landslide. He also willfully made statements that in context
By a
encouraged and
lot.
foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Thus incited by President Trump, members of
Something about hearing Trump quotes read by the clerk in monotone is interesting.
objectives interfere with the joint session's solemn constitutional duty to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, unlawfully breached and vandalized the Capitol, injured and killed law enforcement personnel, menaced members of Congress, the Vice President, and congressional personnel, and engaged in other violent, deadly, destructive, and seditious acts. President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021,
They said, "Sir, you won by a lot."
of the results of the 2020 presidential election. Those prior efforts included a phone call on January 2, 2021, during which President Trump urged the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough
Raffensperger's, yeah. Susan Collins thinks he's learned his lesson, guys. Everybody relax.
security Raffensperger if he failed to do so. In all this, President Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and its institutions of government,
A lot of people thinking 55-45. That's interesting.
with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled a co-equal branch of government. He therefore betrayed his trust as president to the manifest injury of
The president got home and his wife said, "Sir, I didn't see the event because they were covering something about some rainstorm somewhere, which I'm sure affected many people. But come on, they've never treated anyone as unfairly as they have treated me."
and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-government and the rule of law. Donald John Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, and demand that you, the said Donald John Trump, should be put to answer the accusations as set forth in this article, and that such proceedings, examinations, trials, and judgments might be thereupon had as are agreeable to law and justice.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place, and they'll vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article of impeachment. Senators, How say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Let's track Republican
Ms.
yays.
Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty.
An historic moment.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, not guilty.
Vote happening now.
Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun.
Mike Braun, who slept, says not guilty.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, guilty.
Republican
Ms.
Richard Burr
Cantwell.
votes guilty.
Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, guilty.
That's a second Republican, right?
Ms.
Cassidy?
Collins. Ms. Collins, guilty.
Susan Collins, guilty. That's three
Coons.
Republicans.
Mr. Coons, guilty.
Am I right about that?
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, not guilty.
Looney Cotton says no.
Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz.
Shocking.
Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty.
So I believe three Republicans so far.
Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham.
Lindsey Graham.
Graham, not guilty.
Shocker, huh?
Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty. Not guilty. Mr. Haggerty.
Not looking
guilty.
good.
Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
That's Ron Johnson.
Not guilty. Mr. Kane. Guilty. Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly. Guilty. Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy.
That's a
not
Republican
guilty.
Kennedy, so people know.
Mr. King. Guilty. Mr. King, Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar?
There's Amy.
Klobuchar? Guilty.
Clobbering.
Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy?
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee?
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan? Guilty. Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis? Not guilty. Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin? Guilty.
Joe Manchin.
Guilty. Mr. Markey? Guilty. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall? Not guilty. Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell? Not guilty. Mr. McConnell, not guilty.
Anybody surprised?
Mr. Menendez? Guilty. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley? Guilty. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Guilty. Ms. Murkowski, guilty.
That's the fourth Republican.
Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mr. Murphy, guilty.
I predicted 5.
Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff? Guilty. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla? Guilty. Mr. Padilla?
Am I right? 4 Republicans so
Mr.
far?
Paul? Not guilty. Mr. Paul, not guilty.
Maskless Rand Paul already leaving. Look at him go.
Mr. Peters?
He just walked right out.
Guilty.
Rand Paul's
Mr.
such
Portman.
a loser.
Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney? Guilty.
Romney guilty.
Guilty. Ms. Rosen?
5 Republicans.
Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, not guilty.
And with that
Rubio.
impeachment, conviction becomes impossible.
Mr. Rubio, not guilty.
There it is.
Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass? Guilty. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr.
34
Schatz?
noes, but Ben Sass, number 6,
Mr. Schatz?
6th Republican.
Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mr. Scott
The
of South
Scotts
Carolina?
can't be counted on.
Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr.
Oh, wait.
Shelby?
Shaheen's a Republican,
Mr.
right?
Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow?
No, she's a Democrat.
Guilty.
I'm an
Mr.
idiot.
Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, guilty.
That's a
Mr.
Republican.
Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr.
7
Warner?
Republicans guilty so far.
Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock? Guilty. Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, not guilty.
There it is. Former President Trump acquitted. Only president to be impeached twice. Acquitted twice. Only president to get COVID. Only president to talk about flushing 10 or 15 times. Only president to claim his wife refers to him as sir.
That's why we have these things. Unless you had a script.
Only president to claim his replacement will end energy and indoor heating and cooling.
Yep. The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. 2/3 of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment
What is Leahy talking about?
exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered. that
Is
the
it an
Secretary be
adjournment?
Directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn sine die.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die. And could I have order, please? The presiding officer, the acting sergeant at arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber. In order.
And there it is, Donald John Trump, known to many simply as Prump, has been acquitted a second time. No other president has been impeached twice, and he indeed has now been convicted. The House impeachment managers, led by Jamie Raskin, will now leave the Senate. As many of you know, the members of the House are not typically, I don't know if allowed is the right term, but they're not welcomed. They have no place in the Senate unless invited, and that invitation has now wrapped up, as the case may be. 7 Republicans voting to convict, but in the end, 10 too short. The count I have here is Richard Burr.
President.
Whoa.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, can we have order?
The Senate is not in order, and the Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Oh, they're
Without
going into
objection,
morning
so
business.
ordered.
This should be interesting.
Does any senator seek recognition?
President.
Senator from New York, Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open. Mr. President, can we have order, please?
The senator is right. The Senate is not in order. Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order.
Hey, thanks for the raid, Hutch.
Conversations off
Welcome,
the floor.
everybody joining from Hutch's stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator from New
President.
York.
The case of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial was open and shut.
Right.
President Trump told a lie, a big lie, that the election was stolen and that he was the rightful winner.
By a lot.
He laid the groundwork for this big lie in the months before the election. He told the big lie on election night, and he repeated the big lie more than 100 times in the weeks afterwards. He summoned his supporters to Washington, assembled them on the ellipse, whipped them into a frenzy, and directed them at the Capitol. And then he watched as the violence unfolded.
I think Schumer's about to
Capitol was
crush
breached,
Republican colleagues
and
here.
his own vice president fled for his life, and President Trump did nothing. None of these facts were up for debate. We saw it, we heard it, we lived it. This was the first presidential impeachment trial in history in which all senators were not only judges and jurors, but witnesses.
And some were sleeping,
Constitutional crime that was committed.
doodling, reading.
The former president inspired, directed, and propelled a mob to violently prevent the peaceful transfer of power, subvert the will of the people, and illegally keep that president in power. There is nothing more un-American than that. There is nothing more antithetical to our democracy. There is nothing more insulting to the generations of American patriots who gave their lives to defend our form of government. This was the most egregious violation of the presidential oath of office and a textbook example, a classic example of an impeachable offense worthy of the Constitution's most severe remedy. In response to the incontrovertible fact of Donald Trump's guilt, the Senate was subject to a feeble and sometimes incomprehensible defense of the former president. Unable to dispute the case on the merits, the former president's counsel treated us to partisan vitriol, false equivalence, and outright falsehoods. We heard the roundly debunked jurisdictional argument that the Senate cannot try a former official, a position that would mean that any president could simply resign to avoid accountability for an impeachable offense, a position which in effect would render the Senate powerless to ever enforce the disqualification clause in the Constitution. Essentially, the president's counsel told the Senate that the Constitution was unconstitutional.
Right.
Thankfully, the Senate took a firm stance, set a firm precedent with a bipartisan vote in favor of our power to try former officials for acts they committed while in office. We heard the preposterous claim that the former president's incitement to violence was protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment right to free speech protects Americans from jail, not presidents from impeachment. If the president had said during World War II that, quote, Germany should attack the United States on Long Island, we've left it undefended, I suspect Congress would have considered that an impeachable offense. Finally, the defense counsel said that President Trump was not directly responsible for the violence at the Capitol. Quote, his words were merely a metaphor, his directions were merely suggestions, and the violent mob was just a spontaneous demonstration. But wind the clock back and ask yourself, if at any point Donald Trump did not do the things he did, would the attack on the Capitol have happened? There's only one answer to this question. Of course not. If President Trump hadn't told his supporters to march to the Capitol, if he hadn't implored them to come to Washington on January 6th in the first place, if he hadn't repeatedly lied to them that the election was stolen, their country was being taken from them, the attack would not have happened, could not have happened. January 6th would not have happened but for the actions of Donald Trump.
Doesn't take a genius
What
to
the
figure that out.
Republican leader of the Senate said. The mob that perpetrated the, quote, failed insurrection, unquote, was on January 6th was, quote, provoked by President Trump. You want another word for provoke? How about incite? Yet still, the vast majority of the Senate Republican caucus, including the Republican leader, voted to acquit former President Trump, signing their names in the columns of history alongside his name forever. January 6th will live as a day of infamy in the history of the United States of America. The failure to convict Donald Trump will live as a vote of infamy in the history of the United States Senate. 5 years ago, Republican senators lamented what might become of their party if Donald Trump became their presidential nominee and standard-bearer. Just look at what has happened. Look at what Republicans have been forced to defend. Look at what Republicans have chosen to forgive. The former president tried to overturn the results of a legitimate election and provoked an assault on our own government. And well over half the Senate Republican conference decided to condone it. The most despicable act that any president has ever committed, and the majority of Republicans cannot summon the courage or the morality to condemn it. This trial wasn't about choosing country over party, even not that. This was about choosing country over Donald Trump, and 43 Republican members chose Trump.
Uh-oh. What's going on here?
They chose Trump.
That was weird.
It should be a weight on their conscience today, and it shall be a weight on their conscience in the future. As sad as that fact is, as condemnable as the decision was, it is still true that the final vote on Donald Trump's conviction was the largest and most bipartisan vote of any presidential impeachment trial in American history. I salute those Republican patriots who did the—
Hey, guys, so right now we're being raided by an anti-Semitic group of people wanting to talk about Chuck Schumer and Israel and dual loyalty and this stuff. We're just going to ban all of it, guys. We're just not going to do it. It's all getting banned. Every one of you is getting banned.
Not sanction the former president's Congress. Because if lying about the results of an election is acceptable, if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political violence becomes the norm, it will be open season on our democracy. And everything will be up for grabs by whoever has the biggest clubs, the sharpest spears, the most powerful guns. By not recognizing the heinous crime that Donald Trump committed against the Constitution, Republican senators have not only risked, but potentially invited the same danger that was just visited upon us. So let me say this. Despite the results of the vote on Donald Trump's conviction in the court of impeachment, he deserves to be convicted, and I believe he will be convicted in the court of public opinion. He deserves to be permanently discredited, and I believe he has been discredited in the eyes of the American people and in the judgment of history. Even though Republican senators prevented the Senate from disqualifying Donald Trump for any office of honor, trust, or profit under these United States, there is no question Donald Trump has disqualified himself. I hope, I pray, and I believe that the American people will make sure of that. And if Donald Trump ever stands for public office again, and after everything we have seen this week, I hope, I pray, and I believe that he will meet the unambiguous rejection by the American people. 6 hours after the attack on January 6th, after the carnage and mayhem was shown on every television screen in America, President Trump told his supporters to, quote, "Remember this day forever."
What is going on now with C-SPAN? Got a backup stream we can
I
switch
ask the
to.
American people to heed his word. Racist Confederate flags flying through the halls of our union. Remember the screams of the bloody officer crushed between the onrushing mob and a doorway to the Capitol, his body trapped in the breach. Remember the 3 Capitol police officers who lost their lives. Remember that those rioters actually succeeded in delaying Congress from certifying the election. Remember how close our democracy came to ruin. My fellow Americans, remember that day, January 6th, forever. The final terrible legacy of the 45th President of the United States, and undoubtedly our worst. Let it live on in infamy, a stain on Donald John Trump that can never, never be washed away. Mr. President, on Monday, we'll recognize President's Day. Part of the commemoration in the Senate will be the annual reading of Washington's farewell address. Aside from winning the Revolutionary War, I consider it his greatest contribution to American civil life. And it had nothing to do with the words he spoke, but the example it set. Washington's farewell address established for all time that no one had the right to the office of the presidency, that it belonged to the people. What an amazing legacy. What an amazing gift to the future generations. The knowledge that this country will always be greater than any one person, even our most renowned. That's why members of both parties take turns reading Washington's address once a year in full into the record, to pledge common attachment to the selflessness at the core of our democratic system. This trial was about the final acts of a president who represents the very antithesis of our first president and sought to place one man before the entire country, himself.
Trump must be furious right now.
Let the record show. Let the record show.
Can't even
Before
tweet
God,
about this.
History, and the solemn oath we swear to the Constitution that there was only one correct verdict in this trial, guilty. And I pray that while justice was not done in this trial, it will be carried forward by the American people who, above any of us in this chamber, determine the destiny of our great nation. I yield the floor.
Trump acquitted is the news. Leahy gone. We'll see if we hear from a Republican.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Sounds like McConnell.
January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try to stop a specific piece of domestic business they did not like.
Vile guy.
Fellow Americans beat and bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House.
But
They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they'd been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth.
that's what the trial was about.
Because he was angry he'd lost an election.
That's what you just said not guilty for.
Former President Trump's actions preceded the riot were a disgraceful
You voted not guilty.
dereliction of duty. The House accused the former president of, quote, incitement.
You just did too.
That is a specific term from the criminal law. Let me just put that aside for a moment and reiterate something I said weeks ago.
Oh, that's rich.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
So he's making a
No
semantic
question
game.
about it.
It's a semantic game.
The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president.
Can you imagine?
And having that belief,
But Merriam-Webster's third definition does not
of the growing crescendo
crescendo.
of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth.
A lot of people getting banned right now. Oh my God.
The issue is not only the president's intemperate language
It's crazy what's happening.
on January 6th. It is not just his endorsement of remarks in which an associate urged, quote, trial by combat. It was also the entire manufactured atmosphere of looming catastrophe, the increasingly wild myths.
McConnell almost seems to think Trump is guilty even of things beyond just the impeachment count, and yet he voted not guilty.
Some secret coup by our now president. Now, I defended the president's right to bring any complaints to our legal system. The legal system spoke. The Electoral College spoke. As I stood up and said clearly at that time, the election was settled. It was over. But that just really opened a new chapter of even wilder, and more unfounded claims. The leader of the free world cannot spend weeks thundering that shadowy forces are stealing our country and then feign surprise when people believe him and do reckless things. Now, sadly, many politicians sometimes make overheated comments or use metaphors. We saw that unhinged listeners might take literally, but that was different. That's different from what we saw. This was an intensifying crescendo of conspiracy theories orchestrated by an outgoing president who seemed determined.
I can barely even keep up banning people. Moderators on Twitch and YouTube, I do need your help here.
Our institutions on the way out. The unconscionable behavior did not end when the violence actually began. Whatever our ex-president claims he thought might happen that day, whatever reaction he says he meant to produce, by that afternoon, we know he was watching the same live television as the rest of us. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners,
Mitch should have been on the prosecution.
hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. He was the only one who could. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. The president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. No. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily, as the chaos unfolded. He kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Now, even after it was clear to any reasonable observer that Vice President Pence was in serious danger, even as the mob, carrying Trump banners, was beating cops and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his own vice president.
Right.
Now, predictably and foreseeably, under the circumstances, members of the mob seem to interpret this as a further inspiration to lawlessness and violence, not surprisingly. Later, even when the president did half-heartedly begin calling for peace,
This is a strong case
right
against
away
Trump.
for the riot to end. He did not tell the mob to depart until even later. And even then, with police officers bleeding and broken glass covering Capitol floors, he kept repeating election lies
This is crazy.
and praising the criminals. In recent weeks, our ex-president's associates have tried to use the 74 million Americans who voted to re-elect him as a kind of human shield against criticism.
If you're just joining us, this is not Mitch explaining why he voted guilty. He voted not guilty, and now he's making the strongest possible case against Trump.
Shield against
It's better than Schumer's speech, quite frankly.
anyone who decries his awful behavior is accused of insulting millions of voters. That's an absurd deflection. 74 million Americans did not invade the Capitol.
True.
Hundreds of rioters did.
Maybe 1,000.
74 million Americans did not engineer the campaign of disinformation and rage that provoked it. One person did.
Wow.
Just one.
And who is that?
Now, I've made my view of this episode very plain.
This is Mitch's sort of last goodbye to say we're done with Trump as a party.
Specific task, the Constitution gives us a particular role. This body is not invited to act as the nation's overarching moral tribunal. We're not free to work backward from whether the accused party might personally deserve some kind of punishment. Justice Joseph Story, our nation's first great constitutional scholar, as he explained nearly 200 years ago, the process of impeachment and conviction is a narrow tool for a narrow purpose. Story explained this limited tool exists to, quote, secure the state against gross official misdemeanors, end quote.
Right.
That is, to protect the country from government officers.
Isn't that what it would be?
If President Trump were still in office, I would have carefully considered whether the House managers proved their specific charge.
So he's basically just saying, even though Trump did the stuff, he's out of office, so that's why I voted not guilty.
The president's speech probably was not incitement. However, in the context of impeachment, the Senate might have decided this was acceptable shorthand for the reckless actions that preceded the riot. But in this case, the question is moot because former President Trump is constitutionally not eligible for conviction.
But he can run again.
Now, this is a close question, no doubt. Donald Trump was the president when the House voted, though not when the House chose to deliver the papers. Brilliant scholars argue both sides of this jurisdictional question. The text is legitimately.
This is what you call an escape hatch. Mitch McConnell has just opened the escape hatch and he's exiting by saying it's a procedural opposition he has.
Reflection I believe the best constitutional reading shows that Article 2, Section 4 exhausts the set of persons who can legitimately be impeached, tried, or convicted. It's the president, it's the vice president, and civil officers. We have no power to convict and disqualify a former officer.
Yeah, doctors should really pay attention to this. If you get hit with a malpractice claim, just retire from medicine before the actual thing goes forward in court. Just use this explanation.
And all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. Now, everyone basically agrees that the second half of that sentence exhausts the legitimate grounds for conviction. The debates around the Constitution's framing make that abundantly clear. Congress cannot convict for reasons besides those.
This is one of the most politically shrewd things I've ever seen from McConnell, which is basically he's staying on the not guilty side as far as a vote goes. He doesn't act to prevent Trump from running again, but he creates a sort of guidepost for the Republican Party to say we are really done with Trump now, and to try to start the process of we care about the debt and deficit and religious freedom, and Trump, what? No. We're constitutional conservatives.
Not limit impeachment and conviction powers, and it has no limits at all. The House has sole power of impeachment, and the Senate's sole power to try all impeachments would create an unlimited circular logic empowering Congress to ban any private citizen from federal office.
That's
Now,
nuts.
that's an incredible claim.
That's nutty. It's nutty to claim that's what it would do.
But it's the argument that the House managers seem to be making. One manager said the House and Senate have, quote, absolute, unqualified jurisdictional power, end quote. Well, that was very honest, because there is no limiting principle in the constitutional text that would empower the Senate to convict former officers that would not also let them convict and disqualify any private citizen. An absurd end result to which no one subscribes. Article 2, Section 4 must have force. It tells us the president, the vice president, and civil officers may be impeached and convicted. Donald Trump's no longer the president. Likewise, the provision states that officers subject to impeachment and conviction shall be removed from office if convicted. Shall be removed from office if convicted. As Justice Story explained, the Senate, upon conviction, is bound in all cases to enter a judgment of removal from office.
If applicable.
Removal is mandatory upon conviction. Clearly, he explained,
This is so dumb.
that mandatory sentence cannot be applied to someone who's left office. The entire process revolves around removal. If removal becomes impossible, conviction becomes insensible. In one light, it certainly does seem counterintuitive that an office holder can elude Senate conviction by resignation or expiration of term, an argument we heard made by the managers. But this underscores that impeachment was never meant to be the final forum for American justice. Never meant to be the final forum for American justice.
These are some real mental gymnastics.
And removal are a
String got in his
specific
mouth there.
intra-governmental safety valve. It is not the criminal justice system where individual accountability is the paramount goal. Indeed, Justice Story specifically reminded that while former officials were not eligible for impeachment or conviction, they were, and this is extremely important, still liable to be tried and punished in the ordinary tribunals of justice. Put another way, in the language of today, President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. Unless the statute of limitations is run, still liable for everything he did while he's in office. Didn't get away with anything.
Yeah. These are the same Republicans who said you can't criminally go after or even investigate a president for things they do while in office.
We have civil litigation, and former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one. I believe the Senate was right not to grab power the Constitution doesn't give us. And the Senate was right not to entertain some light-speed sham process to try to outrun the loss of jurisdiction.
Law and order, guys.
It took both sides more than a week just to produce their pretrial briefs. Speaker Pelosi's own scheduling decisions conceded what President Biden publicly confirmed: a Senate verdict before Inauguration Day was never possible. Now, Mr. President, this has been a dispiriting time. But the Senate had done our duty.
Is that right?
Framers firewall held up again. On January the 6th, we returned to our posts and certified the election. We were uncowed. We were not intimidated. We finished the job. And since then, we resisted the clamor to defy our own constitutional guardrails in hot pursuit of a particular outcome. We refused to continue a cycle of recklessness by straining our own constitutional boundaries in response.
He's disgusting.
The Senate's decision today does not condone anything that happened on or before that terrible day.
Well, it may not, but it says if anyone else does it again, they also won't be held accountable.
Did what the former president failed to do. We put our constitutional duty first.
President. The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take this time to explain why I voted to convict.
So these are going to continue. I do want to get caught up on a whole bunch of stuff. If you're just joining us, the Senate did vote today to acquit Donald Trump in the second impeachment trial, only president to be impeached twice. 7 Republicans voting to convict. Those 7 are Richard Burr, Cassidy, whose first name I forget. Is it Constantine Cassidy? I don't remember. Cassidy, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Willard, Mitt Romney, Ben Sass, and Pat Toomey. All Republicans voting to convict, ending at 57-43, 10 short of the number needed. So many people have been supporting the stream, and I really appreciate that. We got a raid from Hutch, who raised a whole bunch of money for charity today, and we love that. I'm so glad people are here on Twitch, and I hope you'll come back to future streams. This, of course, will be the last stream for this impeachment trial, since the impeachment trial is over. Thank you to, I don't even know, it must be about 24 people who grabbed Twitch subscriptions, so let's just call it 33. People have also been just massively dumping memberships at joinpacman.com. And if you've been enjoying the coverage for the impeachment trial, this would be a great time to grab such a membership on my website. Let me just quickly thank a few people here. Bobby Jean signed up at joinpacman.com. Colin Miltonberger, Jamie Hipsher, not hipster, Hipsher, Nicole Joliffe, Brenna Braithopt. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Having a lot of pronunciation problems here. Thanks to all of you. Very much appreciate that. And we do have that coupon code above my head, joinpacman.com. So many different super chats. I can't possibly get to them, but I know people enjoyed seeing them coming up and down. A few people asking whether Trump will run again. I don't believe Trump will run again. I don't think so. I think he's going to be sick of all of this stuff. We did have to ban a lot of people during this. It's sad that we did. A few of them are asking to be unbanned. Let me just quickly adjudicate these. Someone showed up today and has never participated today, but they showed up and said, "Your tears are delicious, demon rats. Cry more libs," while burring the country. They were banned. They appealed it with the message, "F off, crybaby demo rat." So that is going to be a perma. That's a perma ban. We're just adjudicating these right now. Another user who has been participating for a long time saying something about, I can't even read most of these. Antifa are secretly Nazis. Law is about semantics, you stupid moron. They were banned, and then their unban request was law equals semantics, don't be a dumbass. We're going to make that permanent. That's a perma ban. You little C, enjoy your echo chamber, you little C. See you. Okay, that's instant perma ban as well. We're just, these are real quick, guys. We don't even have to pay too much. These are just so easy. I'm being respectful and never insulted anyone personally. Please allow dissenting opinions. That's respectful. So we're going to do one unban. Okay, I'll do one unban. So we've caught up on unban requests. 3 are perma, and 1 we have reintegrated back in. Let me just look at a few other super chats. Saying you cannot convict Trump because you would have to have the ability to remove him from office is like saying you can't convict someone of a crime if they're already in jail. That's a fair point. Yeah, it's ridiculous. David, would the GOP have voted differently if it was anonymous? Are they afraid? Yes, I don't know. I can't say for sure how many, but if this was a secret ballot, more Republicans would have voted to convict than the number that did. No doubt about it. Stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone or incite a mob to attack the Capitol and be acquitted by the Senate. Surreal and sad. Very much so. Very, very much so. It's an extremely sad day, but a predictable one. A predictable one. Let's see here. So Trump being acquitted, isn't that going to create a third political party for Trump? I hope so. I hope Trump does launch his third party. Does this mean President Biden can do whatever he wants? I guess. Yeah. I guess so. Kazim says he's saying file criminal charges. That's pathetic. It is. A military general commits war crimes. During the trial at The Hague, they are reminded he's a retired general. Acquitted. Well said. The GOP just eliminated any remaining belief in democracy in America. This is literally the fall of American democracy. Streaming live. Sad day. Danny Thompson says, is this Mitch McConnell putting his party and Donald Trump on notice that they will deal with Trump from within the party? I don't know. I don't know if that's what he's doing. The opposite of what the House Republicans did not do with Marjorie Taylor Greene and her committee assignments or only words. It's too early to know. We have to wait and see if that's really what they are planning to do. Big thank you to Michael Messmer, who just signed up at joinpacman.com. I really appreciate everybody. I think it's about 36 hours of impeachment stuff that we streamed this week, and really appreciate the support and everybody signing up on my website. I am planning, I've been asked on Thursday, the GameStop hearings are taking place. I think it's going to be nutty. The GameStop Robinhood hearings are on Thursday. I do plan to stream those live, and I hope you'll join me for those. Make sure you're following on Twitch and subscribed free on YouTube just to be notified when we go live on Thursday. It's going to be wild. It's going to be nuts. I look forward to seeing AOC question, folks. Thanks to Kristen Martin for signing up on my website as well. Appreciate that. Let's see. I missed some super chats. People are angry. There is no chance we avoid going high when they set the bar so low. Anything we do is high compared to this low bar set by Trump. McConnell lauding the Senate for not rushing a process to outrun their jurisdiction regarding impeachment in an unrelated note, Supreme Court pick. Te amo, Paul, says Roni Grea. Trump will not go away. He will charge up his cult to go after his enemies now. Yes, a lot of people making really, really good points. All right, everybody. Trump acquitted. The rare weekend stream, but it was too important not to be here for it. I appreciate everybody who joined me. Let's now send a raid out. Let's send it to, let's raid Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura over on Twitch. That is going to do it for me, but we have so much more. I mean, it's crazy what we have coming up this week. Also, Noam Chomsky will be a guest on the show. Hello, breaking. Noam Chomsky will be a guest on the show. So a lot of really great things coming up. All right, guys, we'll see everybody soon.